This week on The Archive on Cinematic Sound Radio. Part 1 of this show that just keeps on giving starts with selections from The Mummy Returns by Alan Silvestri. Then Watch Your Heads, as Cue the Winged Serpent is about, with music by Robert O. Ragland. And then the show celebrates 60 years of laughter from the Carry On films with a re-recorded suite of music by Eric Rogers. Part 2 of the show features music from the 1988 return of the classic TV series Mission Impossible by Lalo Schifrin. Celebrate what would have been the 65th birthday of James Horner by playing 2 tracks of James Horner The Classics. Play selections from Return of the Swamp Thing by Chuck Cirino. And then finish with a tribute to the late Patrick Williams by playing a suite from his 1979 Western score, Butch and Sundance, The Early Days. My name is Jason Drury. Thank you very much for listening. Sit back, relax, and
stop messing about.
as this edition of The Archive from Cinematic Sound Radio begins now.
This is The Archive on Cinematic Sound Radio with your host, Jason Drury.
Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Cinematic Sound Radio's Archive. I'm Jason Drury, coming to you from a very sunny Ramsgate in Kent, England. Hello to our listeners at WROCK Radio, cinematicsound.net, and through iTunes or Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, TuneIn, Google Play, and where any other podcast provider is found. It's great to have you join us for the show. If you're listening to this program through iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please take the time to rate and review this show. It really helps get the show and Cinematic Sound Radio noticed. This show will also now be syndicated on Movie Scores and More Radio at moviescoreradio.com, and a huge welcome to anyone joining us on that distinguished platform. Now, this version of Cinematic Sound Radio is dedicated to new releases and new recordings of older scores from film and television. During each programme, I will also mine the vast film music archive with my very own Cinematic Sound Radio shovel to unearth beloved favourites and forgotten gems. Now, this show will have a slight change in format from this edition onwards, as it will be released in 2 sections over the week. So it's the same show, just cut roughly in half for your listening pleasure. Now, to start the first part of this week's show, we begin with a real musical barnstormer with Alan Silvestri's score to the 2001 sequel The Mummy Returns. Now, if you want to listen to music from Jerry Goldsmith's work for The Mummy, go to the second of my Mike Ross Trevor shows on Cinematic Sound Radio, where you will be catered for heartily there. Now then, The Mummy Returns. Written and directed by Stephen Sommers, and starred Brendan Fraser, Rachel Weisz, John Hannah, Arnold Vosloo, Ode Fair, and Patricia Velasquez, all returning from the first film, with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson in his first ever film role as the Scorpion King. The story is set in 1933, approximately 9 years after the events of the first film. Rick O'Connell is now married to Evie, and the couple have settled in London, where they are raising their 8-year-old child, Alex, when a chain of events finds the corpse of Imhotep resurrected in the British Museum. The mummy Imhotep walks the earth once more, determined to fulfill his quest for immortality. But another force has also been set loose in the world, one born of the darkest rituals of ancient Egyptian mysticism, and even more powerful than Imhotep. When these two forces clash, the fate of the world will hang in the balance, sending the O'Connells on a desperate race to save the world from unspeakable evil and rescue their son before it is too late. The Mummy Returns is one of my favourite things, said Alan Silvestri. Finding the project at first intimidating and carrying on with something first visited by Jerry Goldsmith, Silvestri decided that his score would not turn to Goldsmith's work thematically, but in his words, drink in the scope of what he had done. Silvestri's score performed wonderfully by the 100-piece Symphony of London Orchestra with a 60-piece chorus, recorded superbly as ever by Dennis Sands, is full of rousing fun, suspense and all-out action, bristling with homages to classic films as Lawrence of Arabia and the Indiana Jones series. The score's main action theme is a true swashbuckler in the style of the great Errol Flynn movies, and is called into action whenever Rick O'Connell fights the bad guys. It is heard in all its glory in the queue of my first bus ride, which starts the suite you are about to hear. The score also features a snarling brass motif for the villains, a mysterious motif for English horn for the Scorpion King. And as per Goldsmith in the first film, Silvestri displays a sense of Egyptian mystique and ancient secrecy with plenty of Middle Eastern atmosphere in the film's musical soundscape. Silvestri's music for The Mummy Returns is a clear throwback to the days when he could walk out of the theatre able to hum or whistle the film's main theme, like a newly grown earworm. Try humming the theme to Dunkirk after you've seen it and you'll see what I'm getting at. This is a kind of score which, even in 2001, was rapidly falling out of fashion, but in 2018, Alan Silvestri is still one of the few masterful exponents. So now, to kick off today's archive from Cinematic Sound Radio, here is music from the original motion picture score to the 2001 film The Mummy Returns. Music composed and conducted by Alan Silvestri and performed by the Symphony of London Orchestra and Chorus. That was music from the original motion picture score to 2001's The Mummy Returns. Music composed and conducted by Alan Silvestri and performed by the Symphony of London Orchestra and Chorus. The original soundtrack recording of the complete score with extras has just been released at the same time as its successor, The Mummy from 1999, both by Intrada Records. If you like action-adventure music, both releases are must-haves for your collection. And also, whilst listening, ponder this thought. Whatever happened to Brendan Fraser?
You're listening to The Archive on Cinematic Sound Radio.
Welcome back to the show. Next up, we go back to 1982 for music from another cult classic. We had The Killer Shark last time. Now it's time for Q, the Winged Serpent. This is a dark fantasy horror film written, produced and directed by the master of the B-picture, Larry Cohen, and starring Michael Moriarty, Candy Clark, David Carradine and Richard Roundtree. The Aztec god Quetzalcoatl, a winged dragon-like female lizard, takes up residence in the Art Deco spire of the Chrysler Building in New York, and has frequent jaunts, as you do, in the midday sun to devour various hapless New Yorkers, as you do. The resulting mess confounds two detectives who are already occupied with a case involving a series of bizarre ritual murders linked to a secret Aztec cult. The film's marketing tagline was, "Its name was Quetzalcoatl. Just call it Q. That's all you have time to say before it tears you apart." Now, the music for this film was written by the very talented and underrepresented and underrated composer Robert O. Ragland. A native of Chicago, Ragland served as a musical director for the Dorsey Brothers Orchestra before entering the advertising business. He then came to Hollywood in the late 1960s and scored up to 50 films, mainly B pictures. In addition to Q, Ragland's credits include The Thing with Two Heads with Mary Land in 1972, Grizzly from 1976, Project Kill starring Leslie Nielsen also from 1976, a number of films starring Charles Bronson, including 10 to Midnight in 1983, Assassin in 1987 and Messenger of Death in 1988, Belak and Golan's Crime and Punishment in 2002, and Downtown, A Street Tale in 2004. Ragland's orchestral score is a real tour de force, and one of those cases when the score is clearly outshining the film it is written for. It is a score that contains strong, very melodic, rhythmic writing, and is a fine example of Ragland's highly underrated composing talent for what is more or less a classic B-movie. Robert O. Ragland died in April 2012, aged 80, and when you listen to this music, you will hear why this composer deserves a rightful place in Cinematic Sound Radio's archive. So, here is music from the original motion picture score to 1982's Q, the Winged Serpent. Oh, I like saying that. I think I'll say that again. Q, the Winged Serpent. Music composed and conducted by Robert O. Ragland. That was music from the original motion picture score to 1982's Cue the Winged Serpent. Music composed and conducted by Robert O. Ragland. A limited edition of this score of just 300 copies has just been released by Kronos Records. Catch it before this release becomes as rare as the serpent itself.
You're listening to The Archive on Cinematic Sound Radio with your host, Jason Drury.
Welcome back to the show. And now to end the first part of this edition of The Archive on Cinematic Sound Radio, we celebrate the 60th anniversary of a true British institution. The Carry On series of comedy films. The Carry On series consisted of 31 classic low-budget films, starting with Carry On Sergeant in 1958 and ending in 1978 with Carry On Emmanuel. But then a reboot was attempted in 1992 with Carry On Columbus. There has also been 4 Christmas TV specials, a television series of 13 episodes, and 3 West End and provincial stage plays. The film's humour was in the British comic tradition of the music hall and saucy seaside postcards. Producer Peter Rogers and director Gerald Thomas drew on a regular group of actors known affectionately as the Carry On team that included such comic greats as Sid James, Kenneth Williams, Charles Hawtrey, Joan Sims, Kenneth Connor, Peter Butterworth, Hattie Jakes, Terry Scott, Bernard Bresslaw, Barbara Windsor, Jack Douglas and Jim Dale. There was your guest star or two in the series, including Frankie Howard, who appeared in 2 Carry-Ons and a TV special. Phil Silvers appeared in 1967's Carry On Follow That Camel, and the German actress Elke Sommer, who appeared in the 1975 film Carry On Behind. Now, the first 6 films of the series, between 1959 and 1962, were scored by Bruce Montgomery, but then the composer most synonymous with the series took over composing reins, Eric Rodgers. Born Eric Gack-Rodger in Halifax, Northern England in September 1921, Rodgers became interested in music from an early age and was a self-taught musician, getting experience by playing piano for free beer during the Second World War. When the war finished, Rodgers formed his own orchestra, which was given residency at the Orchard Rooms at London's Trocadero. There he gained a reputation during the early 1950s for being a talented arranger and conductor for musical variety theatre in London's West End. He began his work on films during the late 1950s, scoring at first children's movies, and then working on such films as the war drama The Wooden Horse in 1950, and arranging the dance numbers for the classic comedy Genevieve in 1953. In the early 1960s, he collaborated with Lionel Bart on the original stage version of the musical Oliver, due to the fact that Bart never actually had any knowledge of writing or reading music. Rodgers acted as an arranger and orchestrator on the production, which premiered on June the 30th, 1960. At the same time, Rodgers began work with composer Bruce Montgomery, becoming the composer's orchestrator. In 1962, Rogers acted as musical director on the score for the first James Bond film, Dr. No, working with composer Monty Norman. Now, meanwhile, Carry On producer Peter Rogers was not happy with Bruce Montgomery, as the composer was finding it difficult to deliver his music on time and was relying heavily on Eric Rogers to complete the assignments. This made Peter Rogers decide to ask Eric Rogers to score Carry On Krabi on his own in 1963. Rogers would then score a further 21 films in the series, including the classic Carry-Ons like Carry On Camping, Carry On Matron, Carry On Cowboy, Carry On Up the Khyber, and Carry On Screaming. Rogers' last score would be for the last of the original series in 1978, the absolutely downright awful Carry On Emmanuel. Now in 1975, the composer relocated to America when he began receiving numerous requests from the States to work on television series and films. He became involved with the Tepate Freeling group, who were responsible for producing many shorts and animated series that were popular at this time. He conducted Dean Elliott's music for Return to the Planet of the Apes in 1975, the new Fantastic Four in 1978, and became musical director and arranger on several animated shows the company was producing at the time, including Baggy Pants and the Nitwits, The Oddball Couple, The Hound Cats, and most famously the classic Pink Panther show. In 1979, Rogers scored the series Spider-Woman, where he utilised some of the music he composed for the more adventurous Carry On films. For example, Carry On Up the Jungle, but in a far more dramatic context. Eric Rogers died on April 8th, 1981, aged 59, in Buckinghamshire, England, with a legacy of wonderful comedy music waiting to be discovered for a wider audience. Now, no original recordings of the Carry On scores have been released to this date, but there has been 2 re-recording albums released with music from the series. One in 2005 called What a Carry On, performed by the Royal Ballet Sinfonia, and 6 years earlier in 1999, the Carry On album by the ever-reliable City of Prague Philharmonic Orchestra. Both recordings were conducted by Gavin Sutherland. Now, it is from the latter album, the Carry On album, released by White Line Records, comes the music from the suite you are about to hear. Now, 4 films are featured, starting with the main title for the 1969 classic Carry On Camping, with Rogers literally camping up the music from the get-go, with a highly upbeat arrangement of One Man Went to Mow for brass and strings. Then comes music from perhaps the best of the entire series, 1964's Carry On Cleo. The costumes and sets used in the film were originally intended for the Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, Rex Harrison epic version of Cleopatra, before the production moved to Rome and new sets were built there. Rogers' score lived up to the dramatic scope, filled with fanfares and all things romantic, as well as some wonderful comic timing. The film itself is best remembered for the classic Kenneth Williams line as Emperor Caesar. "Infamy! Infamy! They've all got it in for me!" Then comes music from another historically set Carry On Up the Khyber from 1968, which is a spoof about life in the British Raj in India. Now, this film has one of my all-time favourite lines from the entire series. When watching a polo game at the start of the film, Lady Joan Rough Diamond, played by Joan Sims, says, "Oh, I say, he did a half crack that one, did he not?" For which Sir Sidney Rough Diamond, played by Sid James' response is, "Dearest, if you can't express yourself in more elegant terms, kindly shut your cake hole." Always makes me laugh, that line, and in some ways reminds me of my late father. I don't know why, but it does. Rogers' music is full of pomp and circumstance and scores the absurdity on screen wonderfully, and as always is in on the joke from the start. The suite ends with music from Carry On at Your Convenience from 1971, A tale of industrial strife at W.C. Boggs' lavatory factory, of which Rogers produced another catchy theme, utilising the song "Oh Dear, What Can the Matter Be" to great comic effect. So, to celebrate 60 years of carry-on laughter, the Archive and Cinematic Sound Radio present a suite of music from Carry On Camping, Carry On Clio, Carry On at the Khyber, and Carry On at Your Convenience. Music composed by Eric Rogers, the re-recordings performed by the City of Prague Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Gavin Sutherland. This recording is available on White Line Records.
This is The Archive on Cinematic Sound Radio with your host, Jason Drury.
And a very warm welcome back to the second part of this week's edition of The Archive on Cinematic Sound Radio. I am your host, Jason Drury. I am glad of your return. Now, to start the second part, what you've just heard was the highly recognisable theme of the classic 1970s TV police series, The Streets of San Francisco, one of the many memorable TV themes composed by Patrick Williams, whose death was announced in July this year. The Archives and Cinematic Sound Radio's tribute to this great composer will be at the end of today's show, as well as music from the album James Horner The Classics and from the cult classic Return of Swamp Thing by Chuck Cirino. But first, we now stay in the world of television with a new release from La La Land Records. Music from the 1988 return of the classic 1960s series Mission Impossible, chronicling, if you do not know already, the missions of a team of secret American government agents known as the Impossible Missions Force. The show was a continuation of the 1966 series of the same name. The only actor to return for this new series was Peter Graves, who played the leader of the group, Jim Phelps. The events of the series take place 15 years after the last season of Mission Impossible. After his protege and successor as leader of the top-secret Impossible Mission Force is killed, Jim Phelps is called out of retirement and asked to form a new IMF team to track down the assassin, played by John Delancey. Now, due to the 1988 writers' strike, ABC decided to launch this new Mission Impossible series using scripts from the original series, suitably updated. Once the strike ended, of course, original scripts keeping in the original series style and tone were produced. Now, Mission Impossible TV series would not be worth its salt unless it featured Lalo Schifrin's classic theme. And sure enough, the veteran composer returned with an update of his theme and also scoring 3 episodes of the series. Other composers used would include Ron Jones, recommended for the series by Schifrin himself, who scored 3 episodes and supervised scoring on 3 more, and John E. Davis, who scored the remainder of Season 1 and all of Season 2, when the series was cancelled in February 1990. Now, the music I'm going to play for you from this 2-CD set is from the first episode of this new series, The Killer, with music composed by Lalo Schifrin and based on a 1970 script which guest-starred Robert Conrad as the contract killer, which was also scored at the time by Lalo Schifrin. For this new episode, Schifrin utilised a 42-piece orchestra and maintained the classical musical structure of the original, utilising his famous plot theme when the team is at work, with plenty of variations of his Mission Impossible theme throughout the score. Schifrin also wrote a suspenseful theme for the assassin, keeping the viewer on the edge of their seat with some masterful, tense writing, which only Lalo Schifrin can deliver. The suite is bookended with Schifrin's famous Mission Impossible theme updated for the 1988 series. So, to start the second part of this week's show, here is music from the first episode of the 1988 TV return of Mission Impossible entitled The Killer. Music and main theme composed and conducted by Lalo Schifrin. That was music from the first episode of the 1988 TV return of Mission Impossible, entitled The Killer. Music and main theme composed and conducted by Lalo Schifrin, part of a new 2-CD set release of the music from the series, limited to just 1,988 copies from La La Land Records. And I am glad to say that playing the discs would not make them self-destruct in 5 seconds.
You're listening to The Archive on Cinematic Sound Radio with your host, Jason Drury.
Welcome back to the Archive on Cinematic Sound Radio. I hope you're enjoying today's show. Now, next up, the Archive celebrates once again the music of the late, great James Horner. To celebrate what would have been his 65th birthday in August this year, Sony Classical has released a new album to commemorate this event, entitled James Horner, The Classics. Performed by stellar musicians of the day, the album highlights Horner's unique legacy in the medium of film music by showcasing some of his greatest ever movie themes, from films such as Titanic, Avatar, Troy, and Braveheart, to name but a few. The pieces have been reimagined in arrangements especially written for some of today's top musicians, including internet sensations The Piano Guys, Cello Wizards, Two Cellos, and Tina Gill, guitarist Craig Ogden, the classical Brit award-winning saxophonist Amy Dixon, harpist Lavina Meyer, acclaimed violinist Lindsey Sterling, and pianist Alexis French. Now, today's show will feature 2 tracks from this album. The first piece I will play for you will be from The Ludlows, from the 1994 film Legends of the Fall. This recording is arranged by Adam Langston, with violin soloist Lindsey Sterling. The second track will be I See You, from the 2009 James Cameron epic Avatar, arranged here by Simon Rhodes, with cello soloist Tina Gill. Both tracks are performed by the Czech Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Robert Ziegler. So without further ado, to celebrate what would have been James Horner's 65th birthday, here is The Ludlows from the 1994 film Legends of the Fall, followed by I See You from 2009's Avatar, from the album James Horner, The Classics. That was a re-recording of the Ludlows from the 1994 film Legends of the Fall with violin soloist Lindsey Stirling, followed by a re-recording of I See You from 2009's Avatar with cello soloist Tina Gill, both accompanied by the Czech Philharmonic Orchestra conducted by Robert Ziegler, from the newly released album James Horner The Classics, released to celebrate what would have been James Horner's 65th birthday by Sony Classical Records.
You're listening to The Archive on Cinematic Sound Radio with your host, Jason Drury.
Welcome back again to The Archive on Cinematic Sound Radio. Now for your enjoyment, music from another cult classic, whose music has now been released for our listening pleasure. The Return of Swamp Thing from 1989, a science fiction action fantasy based on the DC Comics character of the same name. Directed by Jim Wynorski, it is the sequel to the 1982 film Swamp Thing, and features Dick Durock and Louis Jourdan reprising their roles as Swamp Thing and Anton Arcane, respectively. Also starring in this film are actresses Sarah Douglas and Heather Locklear. After her mother's mysterious death, Abigail Arcane travels to the Florida swamps to confront her evil stepfather, Dr. Arcane, who has been resurrected after his death in the first film. In an attempt to stave off the effects of aging, Dr. Arcane, assisted by Dr. Lana Zoel, combines genes in various swamp animals and human beings, creating an army of monsters known as the Unmen. Dr. Arcane then tries to use his stepdaughter Abby in his genetic experiments until she is rescued by Swamp Thing, a scientist previously transformed into a bog creature after a confrontation with the evil Doctor. The score for this film comes from director Wynorski's regular collaborator Chuck Cirino. Cirino grew up in South Florida, making short films as a teen. His quest to shoot, edit and show others his work landed him his first job as a station manager, creating local public access TV content in Pennsylvania. Soon Hollywood called him west, where he began editing and directing high-end network television commercials at videography studios in Los Angeles. Cirino then split his career into two halves, as while he was directing network Saturday morning children's shows like the Mr. Potato Head Show and the Amazing Live Sea Monkeys, he also started a career as a film composer, scoring over 70 feature films to date in a career now spanning over 40 years. Now for the film, the small musical budget was able to accommodate some acoustic instruments to augment Cirino's electronic setup, a small brass section including flugelhorn and trumpets, a recorder soloist, and also an electronic valve instrument was implemented. In the score, every major character has their own motif. Swamp Thing has an 8-note piece. The love theme for Swamp Thing and Abby is played on recorder and electronic strings, and the theme for the villain Arcane comprises of a tick-tock sound, slowly winding down. The score has a clear influence of the great composer Ennio Morricone, as both Cirino and director Wynorski are huge fans. This is clearly apparent from the opening title track of the album, Once Upon a Time in the Swamp. Now, despite the budget constraints, this quirky but entertaining score to this cult classic has earned its addition to Cinematic Sound Radio's archive. So, here is music from the original motion picture score to the 1989 film The Return of Swamp Thing. Music composed by Chuck Cirino. That was music from the original motion picture score to The Return of Swamp Thing. Music composed by Chuck Cirino. The original soundtrack recording is now available on Dragon Domain Records. Now, sadly, we've come to the end of this edition of the Archive on Cinematic Sound Radio. Thank you to WROCK Radio for putting this show on the WROCK Radio airwaves. It can be found at wrockradio.com. This show will eventually be on the Movie Scores and More radio network, and they can be found at moviescoreradio.com. Feel free to reach out to Cinematic Sound Radio by emailing at cinematicsound@yahoo.com, and don't forget to visit cinematicsound.net to hear an archive version of this show, which is appropriate as this show is called The Archive, and many years of previous Cinematic Sound Radio programming, which is not called The Archive. The show is also on Apple Podcasts, and if you can, please rate and review the show. It really does help get Cinematic Sound Radio noticed. I would also like to thank Tim Burden for providing his voice on the bumpers and stings you heard on this week's show, Derek Coscina for writing the Archive's intro music, and of course my good friend Eric Woods for letting me loose on his station. I would also like to thank Gary Kester for his help on the audio clips you heard at the start of this week's show, and my good friend John Mansell from Movie Music International for the additional research he provided for the programme. We end today's archive by paying tribute to the prolific film and TV composer Patrick Williams, whose death was announced at the end of July this year, aged 81 years old. Patrick Moody Williams was born in Bonne Terre, Missouri on the 23rd of April 1939. He graduated from Darren High School in 1957 and earned a history degree from Duke University in 1961. Although he was always passionate about music, his parents hoped he would find a more practical profession. He never did. After moving to New York City, he married Catherine Greer in 1962, a health insurance underwriter, who supported him at first, but eventually Williams found lucrative employment writing music for advertising jingles. By the late 1960s, he was tired of advertising work, and inspired by Henry Mancini, Williams moved to California to try his luck writing music for movies. After hearing some of his work, Mancini and his wife Ginny helped him get one of his earliest assignments for the 1968 James Garner Debbie Reynolds comedy How Sweet It Is. His music would appear on 65 feature films, including Used Cars in 1980, Jonathan Demme's Swing Shift in 1984, Carl Reiner's comedy All of Me, also in 1984, with Steve Martin and Lily Tomlin, and John Waters' Cry Baby in 1990, which starred Johnny Depp. In 1979, Patrick Williams was nominated for an Academy Award for his adaptation of classical melodies for the score for Breaking Away, the Peter Yates coming-of-age film, which starred Dennis Christopher and Dennis Quaid. But it is his music for television of which Patrick Williams will be best remembered for. Memorable themes and music for series such as Lou Grant, The Magician, The Bob Newhart Show, and The Streets of San Francisco all came from the pen of Patrick Williams. Other TV work included episodes of Columbo, Cannon, The Simpsons, and Monk, as well as over 100 television movies. His work in the medium earned him 22 Emmy nominations, of which the composer won 4 times. Patrick Williams was also known as a prolific arranger in the music industry, working for, amongst others, artists such as Neil Diamond, Natalie Cole, Gloria Estefan, Barbra Streisand, Michael Bublé, Jack Jones, Andrea Bocelli, Paul Anka, Barry Manilow, and Russell Watson. He also arranged and conducted Frank Sinatra's last ever studio recordings, Duets and Duets 2. In addition to his wife, with whom he lived in Los Angeles, Williams is survived by a sister, a brother, 2 daughters, a son, and 5 grandchildren. Now today's tribute to Patrick Williams will feature a score he composed in 1979 for a sequel to a famous western, but in itself has been more or less forgotten over the preceding years. Butch and Sundance, The Early Days, is a 1979 prequel of sorts to the classic 1969 film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and starred Tom Berenger as Butch Cassidy and William Catt as the Sundance Kid. It was directed by Richard Lester and written by Alan Burns and William Goldman, and chronicles the 2 notorious outlaws' lives in the years before the events portrayed in the 1969 movie. The score will be the first of 2 collaborations with director Richard Lester, the other being Cuba, which starred Sean Connery, also released in 1979. His score for Butch and Sundance was filled with adventurous grandeur and wonderful melodic passages, with at times an Irish vibe, complementing the visuals, the film's comedic elements, and the drama to great effect. This is what Patrick Williams told John Mansell in a 2013 interview about the score. I utilised a symphony orchestra for the score, and at the request of Richard Lester, I tried to find some evocative and ethnic-sounding instrumentation. He was very strong on the idea that the American West was an amalgam of many European cultures, especially Irish, so I tried to give the score somewhat of an Irish twist, while keeping it American at the same time. Now the suite you're about to hear features the movie's climactic train robbery, which was composed in 3 sections and highlights the dramatic writing style of a composer who will be greatly missed in the world of film and TV music. So now, the Archive and Cinematic Sound Radio pays tribute to the late Patrick Williams by playing music from his original motion picture score to the 1979 western Butch and Sundance, The Early Days. The original soundtrack recording was released by Kurtzerland Records. Thank you very much for listening. I do hope you enjoyed today's show, and until the next time I dig up more items for the Cinematic Sound Radio Archive, from me, Jason Drury, is take care and happy listening.
Thank you for listening to Cinematic Sound Radio. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please email us at cinematicsound@yahoo.com. Don't forget to check out Cinematic Sound Radio at cinematicsound.net on the web, at CinSound Radio on Twitter, and at Cinematic Sound on Facebook. And if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, please take a moment right now to rate the show and write a brief review. And don't forget to tell all your friends about the program as well. We really appreciate the support. And please check out our affiliates at WROCK Radio at WROCKRadio.com and Movie Scores and More Radio at MovieScoreRadio.com.